resistance are quite good at the present time. That brings me to my final point. What we've had, I think resistance is good, and we need to bust the pay limit and support revolts everywhere, and food riots, and whatever people feel they need to do in order to protect their living standards. But it's clearly not good enough, because what we're confronted with is a crisis that reflects in a very pure way the logic of capitalism. What's happened with neoliberalism is that much of the more kind of, at least in countries like this, the more kind of benevolent and fluffy features that got built into the system, to a very large extent as a result of the pressure of workers' struggles and workers' resistance, and even, God help us, in the past Labour governments, most of those features, or a lot of those features, have been stripped away. And what we're confronted with is the pure logic of capital, the pure logic of competition and exploitation. And what we need something else. We need to organise society, we need to organise the world on the basis of a different kind of social logic. And in particular, one that ends the blind process of competition that is critical to producing the present crisis. We need an economic system which involves planning, in other words, collectively deciding where we want society to go and working out ways of getting it to where we want to go, but we also want that planning to be democratic. In other words, we need a world in which ordinary working people collectively and democratically control the resources of the world and decide what to do with them. In other words, we need socialism, a word that, despite the great move to the left that the Labour Party conference is supposed to have undergone this week, didn't really seem to be on anyone's lips. But confronted with the kind of crisis of capitalism that we now have, that's what we need. We need socialism, and we need to fight for it. Let me answer the kind of tough question about whether Marx's theory of capitalism is just a theory about industrial capitalism, and therefore is obsolete. It's certainly not obsolete. I mean, Marx understood that in a capitalist economy there are all sorts of activities that take place that are organised on a capitalist basis that don't necessarily involve producing things, but nevertheless, where we can only say we live in a capitalist economy once capitalism and the kind of exploitation and competition I was talking about shapes how we produce things. And even though I think it's actually less than a quarter of the workforce are involved in manufacturing in this country, in other words, are involved directly in producing things, that doesn't mean that we don't live in an economy central to which is centrally shaped by capitalist organisation of production. There's still quite a lot of manufacturing production in this country, but also, you know, as all the talk about China illustrates, there's an enormous amount of manufacturing going on in other parts of the world. And one of the problems when people say, oh, we live in an economy, I mean, you haven't said these things, you made very precise points, but sometimes people say, oh, we're just living on thin air, you know, we live in a weightless economy, it's all postmodern and things like that. What they forget about is how dependent we are on physical things, on things like this table and watch and my mobile phone and so on. Now, I'm absolutely sure my mobile phone wasn't produced in this country, but it was produced somewhere as part of a global capitalist system with which we're very closely interconnected. So industrial capitalism is very important to the way in which capitalism works. And the largest economies in the world, the United States, Japan, Germany and China, those are the four largest economies in the world, are all still very major industrial producers. Secondly, in some ways the capitalism that we live in today is more like the capitalism of Marx's time than it was, say, the capitalism that I was brought up in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. You know, if you read Marx's Capital, he talks a lot about what we call the financial markets and speculation and the kind of crises that produce, precisely because 19th century capitalism was what we now call deregulated, much less state controls, say, than there were in the middle of the 20th century. There's a certain sense in which it's more complicated than that, but partly what neoliberalism has done is to take us back to the much more deregulated free market capitalism of the 19th century, but on a much vaster and more globalised scale. So that's a long answer to your question. I still think Marx's analysis is very relevant. Then there were so many difficult questions. Let me just say something about inflation. Sure, they say that inflation is peaked. How do they know? I mean, you know, the situation changes day by day. I mean, on Monday, I think it was, the price of oil had its biggest single rise in any day, you know, since they started counting the price of oil. Now, there are all sorts of technical explanations about why that happened, but the price of oil is still higher than it was a week or 2 weeks ago. And, you know, in a way, that's the kind of time frame that we're operating in, because the system is suffering such an intense series of shocks. So, what I think one can say is, if there's a severe recession, that will produce a fall in the rate of inflation. But I don't think you can simply assume that there'll be a rapid fall in the rate of inflation. And I think it's very important still to understand that prices, particularly of basic commodities, have risen very substantially. And they have to stop our wages rising to compensate us for those increases. They're clearly very strongly committed to that. The central bankers talk about, it's bad enough having inflation, but we have to avoid secondary effects. What they mean by secondary effects is wages rising to compensate for the rises in inflation. Now that brings me to Canvas's question, which is, well, wouldn't rising wages be a way out of the crisis for them? A Marxist economist in the 1930s, John Strachey, put it very well. He said that capitalism is confronted by the dilemma of profits or plenty. In other words, were it not for the issue of profits, then the solution would be very simple. You would increase everyone's living standards, like I said, give everyone £5,000, and that would, increase spending and keep the economy motoring along. But the question is where the £5,000 would come from. Would it, if there were compensating wage increases, more straightforwardly, where those increases would come from would be the pockets from the reserves of the employers. It would bite into their profits, and that's the problem that they're faced with in what seems like quite a common sense solution. So that's the difficulty with that kind of Keynesian solution. Then let me just deal with a couple of other points, and then I'll stop. The differences. You asked about the differences between what the British Central Bank is doing and what the American Central Bank is doing. The difference, the critical difference, is that the US is still the centre of the global capitalist system and enjoys enormous power over that system. Most obviously, the dollar is the main reserve currency. The US is still able just to print as many dollars as it wants, and people around the world still accept those dollars. In the case of China, they're holding nearly 2 trillion American dollars, which they then lend back to the Americans to help the American economy to function. That's a sign of the decline of the American economy. But nevertheless, because it's at the centre of the system, and because everyone still accepts the US's money, the American Central Bank has much more room for manoeuvre than the Central Bank of Britain or even of the Eurozone. Mervyn King, or I forget the name of the guy who heads the European Central Bank, they have much more limited room for manoeuvre because they're not in the same situation of power. So it's easier for the Americans to break the rules, as they do. They break the rules of neoliberalism all the time. They have a huge foreign debt, you know, all sorts of things. That reflects their pivotal position in the system. And